All right, y'all. Good afternoon. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And we're so glad that you're joining us today as we celebrate Pride Month with today's virtual History at High Noon, Secret Codes, Darkened Windows, the Hidden History of Raleigh's LGBTQ plus community. We ask that you please type your questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the talk, I will ask our speaker as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome our speaker today, Heather Leah, historian and multi-platform producer for WRAL. Heather is a fifth-generation Raleighite and professional historian who explores lost history that's often not found in the mainstream history books. For nearly a decade of uncovering hidden history, she's dug through the state archives, explored underground tunnels and secret places, and interviewed longtime Raleigheites for oral histories, and brought those photos and stories to life for all of us. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Heather. The floor is officially yours. Welcome back, and thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I always love giving presentations for the museum, whether virtual or in person, and I'm especially excited to share this history because this is a history that's pretty close to my heart, and it's also a history that I think we don't know that much about unless we were there. This history is not history that I've been able to really find in books. Most of what I'm going to show you today is oral history from people that were willing to talk to me and share their stories, who are members of the LGBTQIA plus community, who were coming of age in Raleigh or in Triangle area of North Carolina in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So a little bit about who I am. So I'm Heather, and she did introduce me. I am part of the LGBTQIA plus community myself. I am asexual, agender, and panromantic. So essentially, if you're not familiar with agender or asexual, I fall under the non-binary flag. So we are going to start today. First of all, I like to ask people, just so I have an idea of the who I'm talking to and what kind of history you may already be familiar with. If you want to put in the chat, give me an idea of your age range. You don't have to tell me your exact age, but are you under 40, over 40? Because that helps me know which of this history you may be more familiar with and what you may not be as familiar with. So what I should go more in depth on and what I should maybe not go as in depth because you already know and you remember it. I'm going to look at the chat real quick. All right. We've got quite a diverse age range here. Awesome. All right. So I'm seeing from ages, some of you may even remember some of these time periods. If you were around in Raleigh during that time period, please feel free to share any memories you have in the chat. The way I find this history is by people telling me about it, right? And you're going to have a lot of quotes in here. Now, just to start with, most of you may already be aware of this history, but I just want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. So we're going to talk about just a very quick history of Stonewall and the history of Pride, right? And where Pride really began. You may have seen little memes and things floating around on Facebook that say the first Pride was a riot. Don't forget, the first Pride was a riot. It was an uprising. So back in the 1960s, I'm literally getting chills just thinking about this. It was illegal to serve alcohol to someone who was LGBT. And I'm going to start saying LGBT instead of LGBTQIA plus, just because for brevity of the presentation, but I am inclusive of everyone when I say LGBT. Consider the plus added. Back in the 1960s, it was actually illegal to serve alcohol. So if you went into a bar and you were suspected to be a member of the LGBT community, it was actually illegal to serve you alcohol. And the reason they said that it should remain illegal is because officials and police said that if you were gay, you were more likely to cause a problem in the community. It would just bring in kind of a bad crowd. And so to prevent this bad crowd or bad things from happening or things getting too rowdy, you just couldn't serve alcohol to someone who is LGBT if you were a bar. Now, there were, of course, bars that then if anything's illegal, there's going to be kind of a market for it that comes in and says, well, we're going to serve exclusively to that community because we know there's money to be made there because there's a need there. So there was one particular location that was kind of well known to the community in New York, and it was the Stonewall Inn. And that was a place where you could go and you could mingle with other members of the LGBT community, and it was a safer space. I won't say safe because these bars got raided by police, if you can even imagine. You know, I grew up in Raleigh. I was coming of age in the late 90s and then 2000s, right? So I came of age in a very different time period. That's part of what got me interested in this history is I wanted to know, what would it have been like if I'd been coming of age in the 60s or 70s while also being a member of the LGBT community? And I've been asking people so I could find out and reading. So it was actually illegal to be served alcohol. It was illegal. It was illegal to if you were it was illegal to basically hit on someone in the interest of having same-sex intercourse, right? That was actually illegal. You couldn't hold hands, you couldn't kiss. All of this was illegal, and you could be arrested for it in New York City. So you can see that there's a lot of pressure forming. So basically, one night in 1969, it was June 28th, therefore Pride Month is in June, right? June 28th. The police came and they raided the Stonewall Inn, but the community was really, really tired of this happening. And instead of leaving or having several people getting arrested while the others dispersed, they hung around. And there were about 6 days of uprising, protests, and some would say a riot. It depends on your view of what a riot is. I prefer the term uprising for what this was. But in essence, they were tired of it and they fought back. So 1 year later, you have what would be considered the first Pride. It was called the Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day, 1970. Here's a picture of it, by the way, in case you didn't know, those other pictures were of things happening around Stonewall. And so this was basically the first Pride March. So here's a few important dates. All right, 1969, Stonewall Uprising, 1970, first Pride. Raleigh would not have its first Pride until 1988. So if the first Pride or the first Pride March was in 1970, it was 18 more years before Raleigh would build up that same kind of atmosphere and that same kind of community courage, ability to do it, and the number of things that allow these things to happen or force them to happen. More important key dates for Raleigh or for North Carolina. Some of you probably were here and remember 2012 Amendment 1. I certainly was here for that. When I saw people voting with that, I remember I grew up in a time period where it wasn't exactly that you could be openly LGBT, but you wouldn't get hurt if you were, at least for the most part. And I didn't really feel attacked by my community. I actually hung out mostly at Legends, Rocky Horror Picture Show, and places that were pretty safe and open. The college I went to UNC Asheville. So these were very, more open and inviting communities. So when Amendment 1 happened and I saw people coming to vote basically to make it even harder for same-sex marriage to happen, I felt personally attacked by my neighbors. It was quite a strained time, I believe, for the community. It really kind of reminded a lot of the LGBTQ community how far we had not come, that we maybe thought we had come further than that at that point. However, as downheartening as that was, in 2014, we had the first same-sex marriage in North Carolina. Again, I remember being very shocked. I did not think it would happen that soon. I honestly wasn't even sure at the time if it would happen in my lifetime. Then 2016, we have HB 2, House Bill 2. Again, if you were around, you certainly remember that. That was what is known as the bathroom bill. And one of the there were lots of elements to it, but one of the main elements that drew a lot of attention and a lot of protest was it did not allow, if you were transgender, for you to go to the bathroom that most matched with your own gender identity. And there was a lot of uproar. I remember at the time, there were people who would go stand around the governor's mansion. McCrory was the governor at the time, and they would stand around the mansion. It was like every Saturday, and they would just blow their horns, the air horn orchestra, and they would surround the governor's mansion and just blow horns and bang drums and shout and just try to annoy him because they were hoping that eventually this could be repealed and overturned. Well, 2017, it was. And then in 2019, Raleigh officially acknowledged Pride Month. Now, we had had plenty of prides in Raleigh before that, but 2019 is when it was first officially acknowledged by the city. Some cities have still not officially acknowledged Pride Month, despite people pushing for it. All right, so now let's go back in time. These are just some newspaper clippings from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, to give you an idea of kind of what was happening around that time, what was in the popular media. So we see here, we've got the CC. I was a little bit before my time. It was open, but I was a little too young to go. But I do remember seeing the CC, and this is an ad for it. You can see here another ad coming June 22nd, 1986 to Pullen Park in Raleigh. It was going to be the 6th annual Gay and Lesbian Pride Potluck. So looks like in the 1980s, there was a start of this potluck in Pullen Park. There's also the Power Company. That's a Durham LGBT bar. And then the front page, which was one of the main publications in the Raleigh area. Now, I know there are others that come from like Charlotte, but in the Raleigh area, the front page was a big one. And you can see here a picture of the time period. And 1986 was the biggest year yet for lesbian and gay pride events in North Carolina. So, and then it's got some listing of things that were happening that year. Looks like they had something called Our Day Out, a march in Durham in 1981. So really these efforts were starting to come to the surface. People were feeling a little bit more safe to come together and really advocate for their community. All right, so I always think it's interesting to drive through Raleigh and try to imagine what things were, maybe what was here 50 years ago, what was here 100 years ago, what was in this exact same spot 200 years ago, 500 years ago. And you'll learn so much about the history of your city if you are able to do that. Well, if you can see, right down here is the Rialto. That's where I would have been going to Rocky Horror Picture Show. And just 2 doors down, right here, you've got this, which is now, I believe, just a bar. But this building right here, this is near 5 Points, if you've ever driven past it, this was Raleigh's first official gay bar. Now, I use the word official because I've had some members of the LGBTQIA plus community who were around in the 1960s, and they remember, and they've told me there were, of course, other places where the LGBT community was gathering and meeting, but they were not officially, legally, with paperwork and documents saying we are officially a gay bar. This is the Mousetrap, and this was the first one to basically file paperwork saying we are a gay bar. That means that it took until that time period to, and I believe it was late 1960s, early 1970s when this opened. It took all the way until then for it to feel safe enough to actually officially file that kind of paperwork. In fact, it might not have even been legal to file that kind of paperwork if we followed in the same suit as New York, knowing that it was actually illegal to serve liquor to the LGBT community. It's possible they weren't even able to open this legally until that time period. But there were other spaces that were serving. But if you've driven past that building, that's a pretty important building. I want to mention this before we move forward. There are no historic landmarks in Raleigh, none, that are landmarked for their role in LGBTQIA plus history. So we have lots of historic landmarks that have other connections to Raleigh history, but there are none that are connected just to the LGBT community. And yet we have sites, like you can see that building I just showed you. And here's another one here today. I'll show you again, this one. These are buildings that could be landmarked as a prominent piece of LGBT history. I do know that the city did a survey a couple of years ago. They actually asked the community to step forward and share their memories. The reality is there's not a whole lot of people who were around during that time period in the 60s and 70s to have those memories, or who were old enough to remember, while at the same time being a member of the LGBTQIA plus community. So if you are somebody who is kind of from Raleigh and you were coming of age as a member of the LGBT community in the 60s, 70s, and even the early 80s, any history you have is very important. And again, I'd be happy to email with you, call you, and talk to you about your stories, because this is the kind of oral history that needs to be collected so that we can actually have landmarks of these buildings that are important pieces of LGBT history right here in Raleigh. So here's another one. The CC, you saw that ad that I had up earlier. I remember driving past this a lot when I was on my way to Legends, and I would see the rainbow flags. But this is not one that I ever went inside. Here's what it looks like today. So it's no longer, I'm gonna close this so that I can see. I have some notes up here I want to be to look at. Okay. It's no longer the CC. Here's what it looked like once it got shuttered. A lot of these original gay bars, or bars that cater to the LGBT community, many of them are starting to close down and be lost. So another important reason to keep this history alive. So I have some quotes now from people who were around to remember these places. A man named Kent Parks, I talked to him several years ago to do a tour, an actual trolley tour, where I would take people around on the trolley and show them these locations and tell them the history. And he told me men like Paul Otto and Art Sperry were the godfathers of the gay community. They owned several pieces of property in the warehouse district. Paul branded the CC for years, and Art always used his buildings and lent out spaces for gay-friendly organizations. So if you want to look back at how, if it was so dangerous, and you're going to hear even more about how dangerous it could be for some people back then, if it was so dangerous, it was so hard to communicate, we didn't have the internet, that you couldn't as much openly talk about and discuss your needs. If you were coming of age and maybe confused, how did you get by, especially during the AIDS pandemic, right? That was absolutely a terrifying time where there wasn't a lot of information or resources. There were people who kind of led that community and offered spaces and information, and really just tried to help as best they could. And these are two of the people I've heard about. Another woman, Karen Waters, she said lesbians, cross-dressers, or African Americans weren't always welcome at some of the early gay bars. It's another important point. Obviously, the LGBT community is not a monolith. And back from what I've heard, and I wasn't there, but the people who I've spoken with, they've told me that back in the 70s, the early 80s, there was some kind of division amongst the LGBT community, and sometimes lesbians weren't welcome to come into certain gay bars. They were specifically for the gay community. And so there were some kinds of feelings about that, right? I also was told by Karen, and you'll see a quote later, that the queer Black community was very, very segregated from the queer white community. So there still were other social issues and intersectional stuff at play. And then here is what the CC is today. It's now this Vita Vitae wine bar. That was the most recent that I've seen it. But things are constantly changing in downtown, so who knows, it could be something different now. I do want to point out a lot of these places that we're looking at, here's the fallout shelter, and I'll talk about them in a minute. A lot of these places are pushed into the warehouse district. In fact, I've heard the warehouse district referred to as the gayborhood, lovingly referred to as the gayborhood. When you go into the warehouse district of Raleigh, you certainly see a lot more rainbow flags, a lot of the LGBT spaces like Legends, and the CC, and the Fallout Shelter, Flex. All of these were in that part of Raleigh. And there's a very distinct reason for that. From what I've been told from the people who, lived it, these spaces were intentionally pushed to the edge of the city in many cities. It wasn't just Raleigh. It was very common for, once it was legal to have a gay bar, that they would then push them to kind of the edges of the city. The warehouse district at the time was not this beautiful, fancy place it is today. Nowadays, the warehouse district is a really up and coming space in Raleigh. But back then, it was actually just kind of a bunch of empty warehouses. I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s. And so if you were someone who maybe wanted to open a bar that would cater to the LGBT community, that might be an easier space to open, right? They might be more willing to give you that property. There would be a lot more space for less money and things like that. So that's part of why the warehouse district tends to be, even today, where a lot of these spaces are. I've also been told, and I noticed it myself, that all of these places that we're looking, here's the Fallout Shelter, we just looked at the CC, and we looked at Legends. All of them have something in common, which is that the windows are just blacked out. For Legends, they have that metallic paneling over them. I always wondered about that too. When I was going to these spaces when I was younger, I wondered, why are the windows always blacked out? And it turns out, again, from speaking to people who had gone to these spaces much earlier than I did, that was very intentional. And they blacked out their windows to protect the identities of the people inside. It still was a very, very dangerous time. And I'm not in any way taking away from the dangers and risks that members of the LGBT community face today. But it was quite different back then. It was, if you could be fired from your job, you could be beaten in the streets, right? There was a lot of really bad things that could happen to you if you were outed. And so they actually would black out the windows, partially to protect the identities of the people inside, but also partially because kind of the outside world didn't want to see these types of things happening. Even today, I think that's something that it's not easy to be openly out in public all the time, because sometimes people will say, I don't want to have to see that. Well, that mentality, think of that. And that's part of why these windows were blacked out. I was told by one woman that they actually even had little codes to let you know if it was a safe space or not, but we'll get there. The Fallout Shelter, this was a little bit later, late 80s, early 90s. The reason I include it is that, one, this space is also where Flex used to be. And it's where the Fallout Shelter used to be. So they both shared, again, a basement space, away from prying eyes in the warehouse district. So kind of following that pattern. But I also found out, I did not know this, so I kind of grew up going to Legends. I found out that the Fallout Shelter, while not, exclusively known as being like, this is a space for the LGBT community, was very, very open and welcoming. And they had industrial nights. And because of that, many, many, many members of the LGBT community would go to the Fallout Shelter. When the Fallout Shelter closed, many of those same people and the industrial nights migrated to Legends. So I wanted to include the Fallout Shelter because it's, in a way, a predecessor to what I would later, be doing with my evenings at Legends. And here's again that same building. You can see Flex is also in there. Again, Flex is no longer in that building. And again, the last I heard, I don't know if things have changed, but there was a lot of discussion about tearing that building down. So again, these very historic sites, we have to make sure that the city knows about this history if we want to have these buildings protected and have some kind of historic landmark status. And then here's just a picture. This is actually the space that is Flex, but this is a picture from the fallout shelter had a kind of like a memorial gathering before the building was emptied out. Maybe like last year. And so this is kind of the community coming in there. So here are some quotes to give you some people from the time period, not just me talking about it. So here's some quotes that I've heard while doing this research. In those days, gay and lesbian clubs would leave a single bare light bulb lit in their doorway. If you were part of the community, that was a signal that let you know the club was safe. And that's one of the things I was talking about with kind of having a code, a secret code that would let you know that this was a safe space. Another quote, everything was underground. Just going into a gay club was a risk because if you were seen inside, you could literally be fired from your job. So again, you can see legends here. It's got that paneling up. Part of this is to protect the identities of not outing the people who are inside. If you weren't around back then, this one really gets me because I was not around back then. If you weren't around back then, I don't think you know how dangerous it was to be out and gay in the 80s. Today, we can go just about anywhere without feeling we may be killed. Very powerful quotes that give you an idea of the kind of the vibe, the sense that people had back then and what they felt they were experiencing and what they were experiencing. And here's just some pictures of the area around Legends today, just showing that, you know, these rainbows and things like that are so much more safe to show today. All right, White Rabbit books and things. So again, something that I missed, but I've heard so much about White Rabbit books and things. This was a bookstore and a things store, apparently. They sold a lot of material that was made for the LGBT community. I spoke to one woman who told me the first time she went in there and she saw a book that it was like a fiction book, right? But the main character was a lesbian and it was about two women falling in love and she just couldn't believe it, you know, and it was something that was for her. This was also an important space for people. By the way, this is what it looks like today. So White Rabbit Books and Things is also gone. One of those places that I think really could be a landmark. And we're going to talk more about why. But this is what that building looks like today. It eventually became the Visual Art Exchange in Raleigh for a while, and then now it's a salon, a hair salon. However, the hair salon, I've spoken to the owners and done a story on them. They're very passionate about you know, serving the LGBT community and being a safe space. So they're very passionate about upholding the kind of the soul of that building. And then here's actually some pictures of inside the building. If you go all the way into the back of the salon, this is still back there. They said they weren't going to touch it. This mural. So kind of some hidden history just tucked away in the back. That was there when it was White Rabbit Books and Things as well. And here are some quotes that people shared about White Rabbit Books and Things. Places like this were the heartbeat of the community. It was a place you could go and not feel alone. You could feel connected to your community. It was especially important for people under 21 who couldn't attend bars yet. That's a really important, very important nugget about White Rabbit Books and Things. If you think about being in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even the early 90s, if you were a teenager, you're 14 or 15 and you are struggling and you're questioning and you're really just, you're not sure, or maybe you are sure, but you're not sure who to talk to. White Rabbit Books and Things was somewhere you could go, right? You couldn't go to a bar yet. So where could you find your community? This was a place you could find your community. And here's one woman who told me about her visit there. She said, I bought a rainbow arch tea light candle holder. It became a beacon of hope for me that one day I would be able to light it and not have to worry about having the Rainbow Association and someone outing me because of it. This is just another little hidden book that we actually found in the corner. And I have to wonder if it's like a journal. It had a lot of little doodles and art and writings in it. And I just wanted to show you because I think it's interesting when you find these little hidden things in the nooks and crannies of these buildings that are an important piece of history. I do wonder if this little journal, just again, hidden in a little corner up here, if it could be from, the 90s or 80s and from White Rabbit Books and Things. If anybody recognizes it, you let us know. So I'm going to go back just a little bit. So White Rabbit Books and Things, Jim Baxter is the owner. And there were a lot of reasons to go there other than just buying items. It also, there you could find, they had like a, again, no internet, right? So how do you find out where you can find resources, when the next Pride March is, when the next, gay picnic is, right? How do you find out about this stuff when you don't have the internet and it's not safe yet to just ask people openly? Well, White Rabbit Books and Things had just an old-fashioned little pinup board, right? Where you could put information on resources, again, flyers about when these events are, so that you could find other people in your community safely. They also had where you could find AIDS testing and healthcare. This becomes extremely important in the 80s, and we're going to touch on that a little bit in this history, but I have another presentation that I've given before, and I've done stories on it, and it was what it was like living in Raleigh during the AIDS pandemic and the AIDS crisis. And I spoke with one woman, and we'll hear a little bit about her, but she said she had lost dozens of friends by the time she was like 30. And she talked about how literally people were just disappearing. I mean, literally, they were just disappearing. One day you would see them at the bar and they'd be looking a little skinny. And then the next time you go there, they just never show up again. You never see them again. And it's because it turns out that they had AIDS and either their family sent them away, or maybe having AIDS outed them. Having AIDS was just, it was, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but pastors were saying that it was the punishment of God for being a member of the LGBT community. So it was kind of a scary times. Not kind of, it was a scary time. So AIDS testing became very important, and knowing how to find it and access it. From what I hear, there were some doctors who wouldn't even treat you. And there were places where you could go basically to die and have care until you die. But even those places were ousted. We'll talk about it. But I have a whole presentation on that, and it was just, that's kind of its own history. So they also would talk to you about social events, community organizing. That was also important, right? Because in the 80s, as we're looking at those ads, we saw that community organizing for the LGBT community was becoming a lot more prominent, right? There was a lot more. In fact, we finally had our first Pride in the late 80s, things like that. So this is how you would find out that kind of information. Places like the White Rabbit, especially if you were under 21. And then there was the front page. You can see it here. Karen Waters, who is one of the people that has some quotes in this presentation. She was the, I believe she wrote for it. Oh no, hers was, I'm so sorry. Hers was a different one. There were multiple publications. The front page was Jim Baxter, White Rabbit. And it was printed out of his back room in the White Rabbit. So we're gonna just touch on a little bit about being marginalized within the LGBTQIA plus community. So again, from what people have told me about that time period and living back then, transgender men and women were not yet on the whole well accepted, even within the LGBTQIA plus community. Black members of the LGBTQIA plus community tended to hang out in separate spaces. I was told about a place called Zebras, which was off Pool Road. It was a bar for Black members of the LGBTQIA plus community. And then some gay bars were they culturally only accepted men, and lesbians were not always welcome. So even within the LGBT community, there was a lot of segregation and even lack of acceptance. And so however you may feel about the rainbow flag, which is now having a lot of additions being made to it, the reason it's happening is rooted in this, right? This history of there was marginalization even within the LGBT community. And I think it's an attempt to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. Okay, this is a somewhat comedic story to me. Every time it's told to me, it's with a little chuckle. So Raleigh apparently tried to outlaw drag. Again, it these things that we take for granted today, not that drag is taken for granted, because obviously it's facing its own pushback today. But things like being able to get alcohol or hit on each other in public, be together in public. These things were illegal at one point in time. And Raleigh did try to outlaw drag. So crimes against nature laws in the 1980s meant citizens could be arrested from a same-sex encounter even in their own home. And in the 1990s, Raleigh City Council tried to outlaw drag. Tom Fetzer, our mayor at the time, believed drag constituted lewd behavior. So the manager of Legends went before city council and showed clips of funny, whimsical drag shows that even had the city councilors laughing and smiling. The owner of Flex made a movie called Camp, and it was about the trash queens versus the glam queens. And it was sort of meant to be Flex versus Legends coming together to battle the mayor and save dragons. So this movie Camp was made by the owner of Flex, or the manager of Flex, and it's basically about these two Raleigh groups. And it was because Raleigh was trying to outlaw drag. So kind of its own form of activism, right? To create this comedic movie to kind of show the heart of drag. Allies. So this is Pullen Memorial Baptist Church. So we're going to touch a little bit on the AIDS panic, the AIDS crisis. During the AIDS panic, Pastor Mahan Seiler of Pullen Memorial Baptist Church, he did something that was honestly at the time mind-blowing, and it really created ripples that reached all the way to Australia. And what he did was he declared that AIDS was not God's punishment of the LGBTQIA plus community. This was, from what I've been told from the people who were there, this was a really huge moment because the churches, for the most part, were just completely against the LGBTQIA plus community. There was no sense of acceptance. And not only that, as AIDS was just killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people, the church, for the most part, was saying, well, that's God's punishment, which of course made people feel better about not necessarily helping as much and providing health care and helping prevent it. They're just like, well, they could stop, they wouldn't get AIDS if they weren't gay, right? Was the logic. And so we don't need to provide care. So this was a really big stance to take, especially as the pastor of a really big historic church. This church dates all the way back to the 1800s in Raleigh. It's right in the center of Raleigh. Like, it was a very historic church. And it is a stance that eventually would get them disfellowshipped, but they kept standing on that stance. So here is some quotes from a book that I was given by a wonderful, wonderful woman who told me a lot about this church. As the AIDS epidemic, at first primarily identified as a gay disease, grew in the public's awareness, many clergymen declared openly that AIDS was proof of God's judgment against homosexuals. These pastors even asserted that this lethal disease was fitting punishment for the sin of homosexuality. Mahan needed to counter their angry rhetoric. On March 2nd, 1986, he preached a sermon at Pullen entitled AIDS, Judgment and Mercy. And while he acknowledged that there are serious and even fatal consequences of promiscuity, whether heterosexual or homosexual, he said, "I do not believe that AIDS is God's judgment on homosexuals." And again, this is their language. So, over a year later, he preached a sermon entitled A Christian's Understanding of Homosexuality, in which he compared the Samaritan in Jesus's parable, the most hated and discredited person in Jesus's world, to the homosexual of today. He credited Dr. James Nelson with his understanding of the Bible that does not address homosexuality as a sexual orientation, nor to deal with caring, committed relationships between same-gender persons. Basically, he said, people who are gay deserve our caring because they are human beings. They are neighbors down the street, colleagues in the office, church members on the same pew. They are aunts and uncles, mothers and dads, brothers and sisters. Obviously, today, this doesn't sound like groundbreaking information, but in 1987, this was a very bold stance to take. So, from again, the people who were members of this church who remember when this sermon happened, they said this was a life-changing sermon for them and for many members of Raleigh's religious LGBTQIA plus community. He spoke the words that brought most of us to tears, that the love between two men or two women is as valid as the love between a man and a woman. I'll never forget that. For members of the LGBT community who were also Christian, this was, for some of them, like a weight being lifted off of them, being told that they could be accepted for who they are. This church then allowed two men to have basically a religious marriage ceremony. It wasn't a legal marriage ceremony, but a religious one, in March of 1992. The church was disfellowshipped. What this church did literally had ripple effects throughout the entire Baptist community, all the way up to the leaders of the Baptist Southern Convention, and all the way in Australia, they were getting comments and feedback on their decisions. Quite an example of being an ally. The Husted House. I want to give us some time for questions, so I'm going to try to move quickly. Back during the AIDS crisis, again, I talked to people who told me about they lost dozens of friends before they were 30. And people would just vanish. It was terrifying. She told me that when they would go to someone's funeral who had died of AIDS, they themselves were scared because they didn't exactly know how AIDS was spread. And they thought it was possible that a mosquito landing on the person's body and then coming and biting them could actually give them AIDS. But they would go anyways because they knew that they had to be together and support each other, and that standing together was the only way to stand through this crisis. But there was a lot of fear within the LGBT community because people were just vanishing and dying. And there was a lot of fear outside the LGBT community, blaming the LGBT community for this new and terrifying disease. So there were news articles all about this Husted House, which I believe is still standing today. And if you know anything about it, please get with me afterwards, because I would like to do a news story and talk about the hidden history of this house and what it did for the community, because it has quite an amazing story, but I would love to hear from someone who remembers this, okay? It could accommodate, it was a family care residence that could accommodate 5 people with AIDS at a time. So far, 12 people have lived there as of this news article. 5 died and 3 others moved elsewhere. But In the months before the opening, neighbors did everything they could to keep the AIDS organization from moving into their neighborhood. Residents circulated petitions, demonstrated, protested, filed a lawsuit, gathering about $5,000 for a legal effort, but they weren't successful. And in 1990, the home admitted its first patient. He might have been its last, says the newspaper article. Less than 24 hours after he got there, the man got scared and walked into a neighbor's house to call the police. So the community around this house did not like that this house was in their neighborhood. Again, this is just a normal Raleigh neighborhood. And these neighbors are terrified of AIDS. And not only that, they're scared of the LGBT community in general, right? There's a sense that there's immorality and promiscuity, and there's a lack of understanding there. And then on top of that, there's now a disease that's terrifying everybody. The neighborhood has their children playing in the streets and the yards. They did not want this house in their neighborhood. However, these people deserve to have a comfortable place where they could go and be cared for and die. And that's what this house was offering. We have a quote, which is being partially obscured here. Let me see if I can see it. It said something, I think anyone, unfortunately, my screen sharing thing is actually blocking the quote, so I'm having trouble reading it. Let's see. No, okay. Well, anyway, it said, we have the rights for ourselves to be secure and rich and safe, and we don't want this house in our backyard. So you can get the sense of privilege, right? That this person literally spoke to the newspaper and was quoted saying this and was not ashamed to say this, that we have the right for ourselves to be secure and rich and safe. So wealth was kind of a part of this. However, there is somewhat of a happy ending to this, and I feel like it shows what happens when you get to know people that you're scared of or that are different than you. Because about a year later, 2 years later, a newspaper article ran an article with this quote saying, most of the residents living near Husted House in Raleigh, including some of its more vocal opponents 2 years ago, have come to accept and support the group home. And several of them now volunteer to mow the lawn, help with cooking, and drive residents to doctor's appointments. That's a big leap, to be willing to drive a resident to a doctor's appointment and not be afraid that they're going to get you sick. I also read a news article that some of the residents even brought Christmas presents over for the holidays. They brought food. The residents of the neighborhood, once they got to know the people living in the home and really understand the plight and the suffering of AIDS, they started to try to help, and they wanted to help. Raleigh's first Pride March. There are pictures of this online if you go to the state archives, but they're all taken by the News and Observer, and I don't have any rights to use them. But if you want to see the photos, the state archives does have photos of Raleigh's first Pride March. It's really cool. But I wanted to put this, at least this ad in here, so we could see what things were like during Raleigh's first Pride March. So it's Pride 88, right? We're talking 18 years after the first Pride March in New York City. Come march with us, Saturday, June 25th. Looks like they started on Hillsborough Street near the Bell Tower, NC State, and they went down Hillsborough Street to rally at the state capitol. It had speakers, entertainment, vendors, and refreshments, and childcare was even provided. And then they said all over the United States, in Raleigh, Memphis, Columbia, New York, Seattle, Boston, and Birmingham, gay men and lesbians are celebrating Pride 88. Pride 88 is the anniversary of one of the more significant events in the history of gay men and lesbians, the Stonewall Uprising on June 27th, 1969. For the first time, gay men and lesbians defended themselves against longtime harassment by New York police. In the 20 years hence, the movement for gay liberation has gained a maturity that commands the attention of politicians and socially responsible agencies all over the country. Yet, anti-gay bigotry still permeates our society. Employers fire workers on the mere suspicion that a worker is gay. Gay people are evicted from their rented homes because the landlord is prejudiced against them. The government denies gay people immigration into this country. The military routinely discharges and harasses gay men and lesbians. Basic human rights, which most people take for granted, are routinely denied to gay men and lesbians. This is the opportunity for gay men and lesbians to come forward and show that we are no different than anyone else. We work in shopping malls, banks, schools, farms, hospitals, dry cleaners, and law offices across the state. We brush our teeth, pay taxes, and vote. Join us in our demands for equality. Now, the kind of equality they're asking for at this point in time, I know when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, again, I told you, I said I wasn't even sure same-sex marriage would become legalized during my lifetime. Well, speaking to the people who remember this first march, they said they were not even dreaming of same-sex marriage equality. Marriage equality wasn't even on the agenda. They were looking for even more basic human rights than marriage. So it's a very different time in society at that point, right? Where people didn't feel that that was even a realistic thing to shoot for. They just wanted to not be evicted from their homes and fired from their jobs and maybe beaten on the streets. Looking for things like marriage equality would come later. And then here's an article. It just gives you an idea of how people viewed that first Pride in Raleigh. They wanted to attract attention. About 2,000 chanting, singing, hand-holding marchers attracted attention Saturday as they held the first statewide lesbian and gay pride march and celebration in Raleigh. And you have quotes saying they carried, people need to know we are their neighbors. Some of us are their best friends. Some of us are their lawyers. Some of us, like me, are their nurses. We're all out there and we've always been out there. They carried banners, cardboard cutouts signifying people who had died of AIDS, and multicolored balloons saying out to signify that they are out of the closet. No one disturbed them, but their route was lined with police. And some preached against them beforehand. The Bible says the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God, said one man who stood on the sidewalk with a Bible. They were gathered together with friends to form around a 10-foot cross near the marchers. We're out here just warning them that God has made a provision that men and women may be saved. So that is a general rundown of what the first Pride March was like in Raleigh. So some of you may remember this moment. I know I certainly do. The first same-sex marriage in North Carolina, and it was on television. I remember watching it on television in disbelief, wonderful, joyous disbelief, but disbelief none the same, but so happy because I didn't think it would happen in my lifetime. And then boom, it just happened. In Wake County, Chad Biggs, 35, and Chris Creech, 46, together for 8 years, were the first to wed, and they were on the evening news. And that is the last of the slides, but oh, I guess I clicked it and it took me through to the actual thing. Hold on a second. Sorry. That was pretty much the end of it. I think it just said at the end questions.
Thank you so much, Heather. This has been so incredible. We have some questions from folks in the chat, if you're good to answer some of those.
I am.
So
yeah, I would love to.
The first one asks says they're curious about what types of records from the state archives that you use for your research.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, here's the final slide.
Oh.
I got it back up. And it's just pictures of today's kind of protests versus the first Pride. So you asked what kind of records do I use at the state archives? So
Yeah.
a lot of times I use newspapers. That's one huge thing that I will do. And I will be honest with you, when you're looking for some types of hidden history, and I call it hidden history because it's hard to, there's no book, right? There's no book out there that I know of, and if there is, please tell me, that is like the history of being LGBT in Raleigh in the 1960s or 70s, right? Or even in North Carolina. So it's hard to find this kind of book, or there's not a book. And so that information is hard to find. So a lot of it is oral history and asking people. By the way, I see some of you are signing out already. So if you want more hidden history, please go to WRAL.com/hidden history. I do a lot of history that's kind of being lost and fading from Raleigh and the surrounding areas, exploring lots of secret underground tunnels and castles and really cool places like that. And if you have history that you think I should cover, please let me know. My email is HLEAH, so H Leah, Heather Leah, H Leah at WRAL.com. And especially if you have any memories of this time period and what it was like to be LGBTQIA plus during the 60s, 70s, 80s, or early 90s in Raleigh, definitely looking for that kind of history to preserve it so that it's not lost and forgotten. So please let me know if you have any of those stories. And I'm definitely looking for stuff on the Husted House too, specifically. But back to the question. So I would say when I go to the archives, there's a few ways to do this kind of research. One, I look for the actual newspapers that were part of the LGBT community's printing, right? So there was the Front Page, and there was another one, I think it was called the Triangle. But I look up, they actually had those newspapers, so I could look at them, right? I could actually look at print copies of what the LGBT community was printing and talking about during that time period, and really get a better sense of what people were thinking and feeling and going through. So that's one thing that I'll look at. I also just look at regular newspapers, just your basic News and Observer, the Raleigh Times, things like that, because that, and I search for certain keywords. And that'll give me an idea too. I can find news articles on the Husted House or on the first Pride or on I know there's like the AIDS quilt and when that came to Raleigh. So I use a lot of these written publications. And then you can also find photos. I can't always use all of the photos of the archives, but I can look at them to at least give me an idea of what things looked like back then so I can describe it. So that's one way that I use the archives. You can delve into it a lot of even more deep ways, but that's a good overview.
I think Stacy got kicked out, but we can move on to the next question if we want. So I think the next one was, why did the NC Pride Parade move to Durham?
I'm sorry?
Why did the NC Pride Parade move to Durham?
You know, I don't actually know that. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Might have to do some research on that one. I see someone here asking about the name of the book.
Yes.
Cynthia, if you will send me an email, I don't have that book on me at this very moment, but I can let you know the name of it. If you send me an email so that I am able to get in touch with you, I can send you the name of that book because I do have that book. It's just not right in front of me, so I don't know it offhand.
Awesome. So I think that was all the questions that we had in the chat. I actually had a question about historic landmarks and stuff while listening. And do you kind of know, like, I guess for like some people who might not know, what are kind of like the process of like getting that historic landmark and like, why haven't we had one yet? And is there a process ongoing right now or anything like that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, I used to be, I've finished up my term, but I was a commissioner for the Raleigh Historic Development Commission, and that's who you go through. So I do know that the city of Raleigh, within the past 2 years, has done a lot of research asking locals to share with them these important locations. So I do know that they have pinpointed some of them, right? But what they really need is people to then go to the commission or email the commission, the Raleigh Historic Development Commission, and basically let them know that you want to see a landmark, right? If people start saying they want to see a landmark, if people bring that to the commission, that is one major way to get that started. They also need a lot of research into these locations. So if you have memories of them, that oral history and that memory is actually really important with a lot of this stuff, because there's not a lot of written history for us to look into. But to start with, you would go to the Raleigh Historic Development Commission, and that's who has the ability to make it a landmark.
Awesome. Great. So I think those were all the questions that we had today. Is there any final words that you want to say or anything for everybody watching?
And no, I appreciate all of you. I'm looking at some of the comments from all of you. Thank you for your nice comments. Thank you for sharing. I see some people sharing like some history in here. Greg Moore, thank you. Mahan. I was having a lot of trouble remembering how that was pronounced. I have it written more than I hear it. So thank you for it's Pastor Mahan. And yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm really excited that so many people were interested in this type of history. And there's a lot more of this history on WRAL.com. So I've done a lot more in-depth research and I've put it in articles. So if you want that information, you can go to WRAL.com/hidden history and look in there.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Oh, yay.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Oh, thank you.
So sorry about that, you guys. Thank you, Heather. Yeah.
Bye. Thanks. Have a great Pride Month.
Bye, guys.
You.